Good afternoon. I guess it's still morning here. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Kurt Langlotz. I'm director of the AIMI Center, and we are delighted today to have Anthony Chang as our invited speaker. I will be introducing Dr. Chang, and then Matt Lundgren, one of our co-directors, is returning from sabbatical briefly and will be conducting the Q&A with Dr. Chang when he finishes speaking. So Anthony Chang is a pediatric cardiologist, physician scientist, and medical informatics innovator from the Children's Hospital of Orange County, or CHOC. He received his BA in molecular biology at Johns Hopkins, an MD at Georgetown, then came to Stanford recently in the last 10 years or so and got a master's degree in biomedical informatics. He's also completed a certification in AI from MIT. He has an MBA in healthcare administration from the University of Miami, and an MPH in healthcare policy at UCLA. So 4 degrees that start with M. That's pretty impressive. Like many innovators, he has an affinity for starting things and then sustaining them. He is the founder and medical director of the Chief Intelligence and Innovation Officer of the Sharon Disney Lund Medical Intelligence and Innovation Institute, or MI3, at CHOC. He also is the founder and chairman of Artificial Intelligence in Medicine, or AIMed, which conducts a variety of activities promoting education and science in AI. He's also the founder and chair of the International Society of Pediatric Innovation. He has also launched the Medical Intelligence Society and is a founder of Medical Intelligence 10, MI10. And he is also a founder of Pediatrics 2040 and related meetings where many of us have spoken and met over the years. Dr. Chang is also the author of Intelligence-Based Medicine, Principles and Applications of Data Science, AI, and Human Cognition in Clinical Medicine and Healthcare. And then in his spare time, he is medical director of the heart failure program at CHOC Children's Hospital. So this is sort of a homecoming for Anthony. He's a great friend and partner to many of us at the AIMI Center. We're delighted to have him here. He'll be speaking today about From the Moon and Formula One to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, Musings of a Clinician-Data Scientist. Anthony, thank you, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Kurt and Matt, for the kind invitation to an amazing center that's so well-deserving open award that AIMed gave to the best center for AI medicine and healthcare just last year. So congratulations on that. I also want to give a shout out to all my many former mentors and friends at Stanford. This is a virtual homecoming for me. It would have been nicer in person, but that's from Ross Altman and Nigam Shah, Mark Musin, Tim Chow, and Dennis Wall, and also in particular Ted Shortliff, who've continued to be my mentor well after I graduated. So thank you, all of you. And I'm sorry if I've forgotten to mention a few of your names, but you know you're always in my heart. Stanford really was a huge sort of trajectory changing point for me in my career. So just thought I have the luxury of not having to talk about deep learning medicine because the Stanford would be the one place I wouldn't have to delve into that too much. So I thought I'd have fun with this talk and talk about something other than a lot of deep learning in medicine, manuscripts and studies. So I usually pause at the beginning of my talk to really think about the many colleagues on the front lines that are still battling this awful virus, and how badly I think we need resources like artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies to fight on these battles and have a chance of overcoming them. So I think something like 25,000 doctors, nurses, therapists, and healthcare workers have lost their lives incredibly this past year and a half. So I want to dedicate this talk to them as well as my Stanford friends and colleagues. And Kurt talked about what I do. I wear multiple hats, but one important hat is fostering innovation for children around the world. And I'm proud to say that Stanford was one of the founding institutions of the International Society for Pediatric Innovation, which kind of spawned not only my interest in artificial intelligence the last decade, but also in terms of gathering people that might be interested in this new technology. So I want to give a shout out to iSpy. So for my math and artificial intelligence side, I've always been a math nerd since high school. And I have to say that one of the inspirations for me was Dr. Bill Norwood, who sadly just recently passed away this year. He was a brilliant heart surgeon, but what I was impressed with more was the fact that he knew I was kind of a math nerd and I was a stats person, to really think about doing research in a very different way. He taught me about chaos theory and complexity theory and how we can find signals in biomedical noise. And so I had an interest really, really early in my career to think about data science, essentially, in retrospect. So Bill Norwood was 30 years ahead of his time in terms of looking for signals in the noise. And I had the pleasure of visiting him earlier last year prior to the pandemic. And of course, I knew that might be the last time I saw him. And he was still teaching me to the end of giving me a few insights. So I owe a lot to him. And might be wondering why Captain James T. Kirk is here. As a kid, I always envied that he had this nifty little computer that he can ask questions. And this is my colleague, Dr. Gil Wanowski, and I at Boston Children's Hospital. And he always teased me about Anthony and his supercomputer. So definitely, I didn't call it AI back then, but this was back in the early 90s. But definitely talked about the concept of having a supercomputer that will have answers to the many questions that we have. And I knew that there was so much more information than what's published. And oftentimes people can't even agree on what's published. So, but Leonardo da Vinci, who's my hero, really had the concept of a supercomputer that will have knowledge way, way back in the 1400s. And lastly, I was a big fan of Alan Turing before the movie, The Imitation Game, and really admired the fact that he came up with the concept of a computational machine that can have answers to many puzzles and enigmas. And as you know, he almost single-handedly was responsible for coming up with the computational machine that deciphered the German Enigma machine. And I had the opportunity to visit Bletchley Park and actually early one Saturday morning snuck across the ropes and sat at his desk, which you're not supposed to, before the security guards came and politely asked me not to do that. But I sat there for an hour and it was just so amazing to try to channel his genius and what he did with a typewriter. So I think it's amazing he did all of that with a pencil, paper, and a typewriter, all of his work. So perhaps no data scientists should complain they don't have enough equipment after that. So when Watson beat the human contestants on the show Jeopardy, I was inspired to take my math knowledge and experience to a different level and perhaps a more current format. So that was the night that I downloaded the application to the biomedical data science program, and was happy to know a few days later that I was accepted, and really started my journey in learning about current era data science. And again, so many great mentors were so patient and so generous with their time. And I really owe a lot to them in terms of what I've learned. And you can see that a typical data science curriculum is not just about machine and deep learning, although you think that with all the topics that people talk about, but it was just as much about databases, cloud computing, where I met lots of phenomenal minds in these areas and really added a lot of extra dimensions to data science. Now, one of the fun projects I had with Dan Rubin in AI and radiology course was, as a cardiologist, I always wanted to see what it would be like to have an MRI, which is great for anatomic delineation, and an echocardiogram, which is great for physiologic determination, put together. I imagine that, how would that be possible? And I talked to Dan, and he recommended I just do a project. I was very matter of fact, just write some code, maybe it'll work. So after 2-3 weekends of MATLAB programming, and I was still learning MATLAB language, and was able to have the few images where you can have enough registration, where you can actually see the two images superimposed. For me, it was such a moving and inspiring moment that with a new resource like artificial intelligence, you can actually realize some of your imaginative dreams in medicine. So that was an early signal to me that this is possible if you just have enough imagination as a clinician. Now, remember that this was like 2012. So really before the deep learning sort of paradigm has shifted into medicine for medical image interpretation. So this was pre deep learning in medicine. And so this past decade, after I graduated 3 years later, it's just been a wonderful privilege to be one of the conveners of clinicians, data scientists, investors, hospital administrators are interested in this area all around the world, and culminated in trips like visiting DeepMind and Google and seeing all the wonderful things that are happening in Silicon Valley. So it's just been a wonderful journey, very enriching journey, not just intellectually, but also the amazing people I've met along the way that are very, very willing to share experiences and their research work without any hesitation. So that's been probably one of the most moving sort of experiences of my life, is to visit all these amazing centers that are doing machine and deep learning projects and very willing to share their experiences and exchange ideas about what to do. I think looking back on my journey, I think the personal epiphany for me was consulting on a 9-year-old child named Elsie, who had congestive heart failure from her rheumatic heart disease. Remember, in Myanmar, countries like Myanmar, rheumatic heart disease is still very prevalent even in pediatric populations. So I was consulted on her as a heart failure specialist from the US. And I was saddened to find out that a few months after I left, the sole pediatric cardiologist in Myanmar, of a country of 80 million, believe it or not, didn't have enough access to the current thinking about therapy and perhaps the kind of surgery. And she unfortunately passed away. So I was so saddened by that, I decided to devote as much of my career to find a way to democratize a higher level of knowledge and expertise around the world, so that everyone, every doctor, every nurse, every healthcare stakeholder can have access to really valuable knowledge and insight, so that no child or no patient should ever suffer from a lack of sufficient knowledge. So I had always thought about something like that, but sometimes it takes one single patient to really inspire you to the highest level. And I think that's what Elsie did for me. So in essence, I think we're at the crossroads, maybe a little bit beyond now, in healthcare and medicine. So we've been practicing evidence-based medicine for a few decades now. I think it's been good, but it's not good enough. So because of all the higher level visions and demands of clinical medicine, we really need for us to practice precision medicine at the level that we like to see. And I know Stanford's been doing some great work in that area, as well as deliver population health for everyone. That's a tremendous increase in sort of area that we need to cover. And I think the only way we can really cover that is execute what I call intelligence-based medicine. So medicine that's far beyond looking at publications for meta-analyses, far beyond relying on experts and their panels of recommendations. We really need to dig deep and look below the surface and look at all the patient data and information that's available, but virtually untapped for the next level of clinical medicine and healthcare. So it's a total paradigm shift to intelligence-based medicine. You may have heard other terms like data-driven medicine, but I think in the future, one of the things I learned is it's not only evidence-based medicine, it's not only intelligence-based medicine depending on data, but it's also a big mandate for clinicians also to make a contribution in terms of their knowledge and wisdom. So it's kind of all three put together to really push us to the next century of clinical medicine. So this really big information and knowledge gap that we're projecting because of the demand for precision medicine and population health I think can be partly made up and neutralized by the mindset of intelligence-based medicine and also getting the clinicians more involved. And this is because we're still yet to see some of the big planes of data and information that will be coming. I think in this decade, we'll be seeing more information than ever before coming in. There's not a lack of data problem in healthcare. There's a problem with being able to have access and have meaningful labeling problem in healthcare with the data. So we have yet to come, I think, more genomic data. We have still up to now very little wearable technology and wearable device data. So the discussion about ambient intelligence is going to be, I think, more and more to the forefront this decade as we get into, hopefully, a post-pandemic recovery and yet realization that we can deliver healthcare effectively and expediently with more available devices for chronic disease management. So that's kind of where I'm at from my journey way back from school. And I thought I'd take about 20 minutes or so and talk about some of the observations I've made, and hopefully that will be very helpful as you go on your personal journey of AI in healthcare and medicine. And I thought of three things I really enjoy watching or just enjoy from a perceptual perspective and try to tie it in to AI in medicine somehow. So one is the moon. I've always been fascinated by the moon. I think every single kid my age at the time of the lunar landing dreamed about being an astronaut. So I wasn't an exception. So I thought about being an astronaut at some point. And I think when you look at the moon, and this is a shot of Earthrise, as you recall, was the first time that humans took a picture of our planet from a faraway space object. And it really was so memorable. I remember as a kid seeing this on Christmas Eve. And Bill Anders, the Apollo 9 astronaut, said, we went all the way to the moon to discover our own planet, the Earth, which is so profound that you have to go away a far enough distance to really appreciate what you have. And I think we can think about that not just for AI medicine, but in our lives in general. I talk about the overview effect, which maybe some of you have not heard of, but it's essentially, and there's some really good short video clips on this, it's worth watching. It's about the cognitive shift that you have after you've been away from your home domain, and in this case for the astronauts, the planet, and then that amazing cognitive shift makes you look at your home domain very differently. The astronauts all felt it when they came back to Earth, especially once I went all the way out to the moon and looked at the planet. And with all the astronauts now going to the International Space Station, even they have a big component of this when they come back, that you just feel differently about mankind. There are no political boundaries that you can see when you look at the planet. And if we were to imagine this kind of a mind shift for medicine, for me, going back to school at Stanford, learning data science and learning things that I really didn't have a chance to learn about in medical school, I came back and looked at healthcare so differently. And it seems so fragile, just like the astronauts describe Earth. So fragile and yet so amazingly beautiful in many ways. And I promise you, it was not like some feel-good kind of drug-like ecstasy trip, but it was more just a more fuller realization and appreciation for healthcare Now, I love being a doctor and I've enjoyed my whole career, especially with patients and families, but this was a different cognitive shift in terms of understanding where the problems are and how we can actually solve these problems. So that was an amazing, amazing revelation to me. It was more significant than I imagined. And for me personally, when I was asked on my exit interview, what was my biggest takeaway after 3 years and graduating? I actually said it was not about machine and deep learning, which was just amazing to learn those areas of discipline, but was more about fundamental understanding how I can change my decision-making as a clinician. I did not expect that. Did not expect the fundamental shift in how I behave as a clinician, as a senior clinician. Usually you have your professional sort of imprint by time you're senior attending. But I, as a cardiologist who spent a lot of time in the ICU setting, I definitely felt like after I graduated, I felt like I spent more time in system 2 thinking, which is the analytical type of thinking, compared to system 1, which, as some of you know, is the more intuitive type of thinking. When I had the luxury of time, I pumped on the brakes more than I did before to just bring a better balance of system 1 and system 2 thinking. And then the other thing, some of the other observations I made was some of the courses that I wasn't sure I was going to enjoy, but I was just curious. I think one course in particular, and I want to give a shout out to Ron Howard. His course on decision analysis was one of the top courses for me in terms of what I learned and how I apply it today. And that was all about simple algorithms and algebra, but I do it to this day. Sometimes when I can't make a decision very quickly, if I have the luxury of time, I will sit down and map it out like he showed us in class for decisions in general. And it was really, really very insightful. And I think overall, I learned that I'm involved with a school right now to rewrite the medical school curriculum. I think as clinicians, I think we need perhaps a better education or more education on how you use intelligence of any kind, human and artificial, to perhaps improve the way we make decisions. So I think just more time on cognition, how people think, what are our biases and heuristics, and how that affects our decision making. All of that, I think, is just not taught enough in professional schools. And perhaps we should consider more of that. And that will indirectly save lives, as we all know. So even something as simple as, what does a positive test mean during the early phase of the pandemic versus later? And for clinicians, not many clinicians probably can factor in Bayes' theorem and prior probability. And I think that's such an important part of our clinical practice. And I think that needs to be mainstream and needs to be embedded in every clinician's mindset. All these very basic aspects of data science and statistics and how do you apply artificial intelligence. I think this kind of trip to another domain should probably also be valuable for data scientists as well. I have the pleasure working with a few data scientists. I'm always encouraging them to join me in clinic or go around with me in the hospital. And they always say to me that they pick up so many things when they do that. And I think if you think about some of the predictions from our data scientists and AI colleagues that publicly even said that doctors are no longer going to be needed, especially radiologists. So sorry, Kurt and Matt, you know that wasn't going to be true. But I knew that was not going to be true because I think it was an oversimplification and probably even an underappreciation what the nuances are in clinical medicine with fields like radiology and cardiology, and perhaps not spending enough time with clinicians to understand that they do far more than making predictions or making interpretations of images. And I think those data scientists that spend time in the clinical domain and not just working on clinical projects will have a better appreciation for what really is at stake, what really is important, what really is going on in real life, real time with clinical medicine and with fields like radiology. And I think they would also appreciate how many holes are in electronic records. I think just because it's printed or available electronically doesn't make it accurate. Although if you're a data scientist, you might think that, but there's so many inaccuracies from electronic records, and we need to fix that. So I think one of the best things about spending time in the clinical domain for data scientists is you truly live and understand the inadequacies in healthcare. Everything from having access to data to having access to or understanding of how inadequate IT infrastructure often is. And also the common saying for doctors, I always tell my junior colleagues that you spend the first 10 years of your clinical career learning what to do and when to do that. But the rest of your career is a much more difficult sort of set of situations, which is knowing what not to do and when not to do those things. So the latter set of issues are very difficult to put in code. I think it's easier to look at a brain CT and say what it is, but the opposite is when do you think is normal and when should you follow up with an exam? I think those are the sort of the more cognitive aspects of clinical practice, like creative problem solving and being able to solve complex problems that we still need to improve on, even with sophisticated deep learning. So I think the bottom line is it's just good to spend time in the other domain. So I think I'd like to perhaps remind our data scientist friends and colleagues that it's not all about the AURLC. And I'm the privileged editor-in-chief of a journal now that taken papers on AI deployment in healthcare called Intelligence-Based Medicine. I see there's a lot of emphasis on data science and not enough on clinical relevance. So I think, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but I think I was asked a great question one time, since I talk about the Apollo program a lot, what is the lunar landing moment in AI in medicine? And I think it's when we don't talk about AI medicine any longer, just because it's kind of like embedded in our daily practice and it's not sort of a big deal anymore. And I think we'll see that in a decade or two. Just like we don't talk about machine learning when we look at Amazon's recommendations, it's machine learning, but we don't say it's AI. We just kind of know that that's what we expect. I'm hoping that we'll see that in medicine someday in our lifetime. So the moon has lots of important lessons for us as we talk about AI in medicine. So another, I think, interesting way to look at AI in medicine, I promised you I wouldn't talk about deep learning. I think I've lived up to that promise. Is Formula One, one of my favorite things I want to watch. And for those of you who know me, you know that I've been watching Formula One for a few decades. And I think I even wrote about how Formula One racing is like an algorithm and model, in that the car is like the algorithm and the model is when the car is in a race. So that's the extent I try to draw in Formula One. But there are some, I think, very interesting and important lessons. One is most people, at least people who watch Formula One, knows who the driver on the left is. That's Lewis Hamilton, the all-time Formula One champion. He just won this past Sunday and expected to be the all-time great. But who actually knows who the guy on the right is? Even I've asked my Formula One friends and nobody knew who that person is. Well, that's Peter Bonington. His nickname is Bono. He is the personal engineer for Lewis Hamilton when he's at a race. So this is the one person that's allowed to talk to Lewis Hamilton and on a continual basis throughout the race. So all this data is coming in left and right. There are just terabytes of data during a race. I don't know if you knew that, but during a Formula One race, terabytes of data is coming in from all directions. And there's dozens of engineers, but Peter Bonington is the only person that can talk to Lewis Hamilton during a race. But he has to filter all of that information and talk directly to the driver during the race. So my sort of imagination and fantasy is that wouldn't it be nice to have that for healthcare, for our patients, that we have a doctor at the bedside, but he or she has access to someone filtering all this information and have really, really meaningful insights on a continuous basis. Right now, the best we can do is perhaps a real-time project in data science, perhaps having some insight that can be published, but we don't have that 24/7 continual sort of feedback that we need. And yet we have monitors 24/7, just that the monitors aren't leveraged, I think, sufficiently to be used. So in healthcare, I really think we need real-time, real-world sort of deployment of AI to affect patient care positively for everyone. So I'm working on some projects that hopefully will get us there. I even call it the agile clinical research sort of paradigm, that we just have important research questions answered right away, very quickly. I think it was embarrassing for humans to realize that it took a few months before we realized during the pandemic that if we prone patients, they were just as likely to survive and without mechanical ventilation. As an intensivist who spent a lot of time with children, that's one of the tricks we use, is to prone children. Ironically, probably a lot of adult intensivists did not know that or did not practice that routinely. So we kind of missed an opportunity to save some lives there. It's interesting that a friend and I were talking about Formula One this past weekend, and with the sort of the movement to have Formula One now racing with autonomous driving Formula One, and there hasn't been a huge amount of interest. So there is still something about the human and machine dyad and interaction that I think is still something that humans want to be part of and want to watch. I think another aspect about Formula One is this really close synergy between data science and a practitioner, in this case, a driver. By the way, Peter Bonington was a data scientist before he became Lewis Hamilton's engineer, just a little bit of trivia. So I think, again, as a reviewer, privileged reviewer of a lot of papers, probably 200 or more in the last year or so, I often don't see a perfect coupling of clinical relevance and data science. And that's sad to me, because that means that great data science talent and time could have been spent solving maybe a more relevant clinical issue or problem. And I think perhaps we can work on having that coupling be a little bit tighter and with a little bit more overlap on that graphic, much more overlap, I should say. I think I've been grappling with, how do you solve this issue of not having enough sort of relationship between clinical relevance and data science. And as you know, a great data science project in AI medicine is just great data science if there's no clinical relevance. So the great data science and a great model can have zero patient impact. And sometimes, unfortunately, we do see that. So I thought of one way is to have every paper or every project to have a composite score, like you do with some sports. You have a technical component and you have an artistry component. In this case, will be clinical relevance. So perhaps we can score projects and papers, and internally you can do this for your projects too. What is the level of data science projected or eventual? And then what is the clinical relevance? And you have to ask the clinical relevance from a group of clinicians so that they will actually give you a more realistic answer. So I think that's one way we can do it, is there has to be that coupling between clinical relevance and good data science. And I think another aspect of Formula One that we can apply to AI in medicine is occasionally someone has dual perspectives, and perhaps that's a valuable asset to a program or a project. Since we're talking about Formula One, this is going way back in history to the 60s, I think. There was this car that was just beating a lot of other cars in different races. I don't think in Formula One, but and this was the Chaparral 2. A few of you might have heard of that car, but not many. And certainly no one knows who the Formula One driver is that's sort of crouched down and looking at the car. And that's, and even my most avid Formula One fans have no clue who this guy is. But that guy is Jim Hall, who is a Formula One driver and a Caltech engineer. So one of the really rare people that actually have dual perspectives. And he actually started race car driving because he needed the money. And also during the time that he was a student at Caltech. But he was a full-fledged engineer who also became a Formula One driver. Now, he didn't win, I don't think he won any Formula One race, but he actually did race for, I think, about a year. Now, what's different about this car, at least compared to cars in that era, is that it has a rear foil. So the rear foil evolved into a rear wing that you still see in Formula One cars today. So his major contribution was innovations about the car design that really made a difference. And I think that special perspective of driver and engineer is special when he's in the car racing. He must have felt, well, I need some way of reducing drag in certain areas like straightaways, and I need to increase the drag a little bit, maybe around turns. So how do I do that, flexibly? And he probably figured out that one way is to build a wing so that you can adjust the angle depending on what part of the track you're in. Now, I'm not saying that no one would have come up with this innovation ever, but I'm just saying that really, I think, gave him an edge in terms of thinking of how to neutralize that problem going around corners. So I think this is, I guess mathematically you can say it's like convolution, right? It's two functions, and then you derive a third and different function from the convolution. So I think we need some champions that actually have both domains expertise and come up with, I think, ideas and innovations that perhaps will be an added advantage for AI medicine. And I know some medical students and young doctors now are getting a data science and AI education. I also know some data scientists now have decided that they're going to go to medical school, which I think is fabulous also, to get that other world perspective. And I just think it will be really helpful to have more and more people that actually can speak both languages to be able to come up with perhaps projects or even more, or I should say projects that are less obvious to people on the other side. So I think that's a wonderful opportunity for those of you who are considering perhaps entering in both areas. But I think the special synergy between the technical expertise and the practitioner in Formula One driving can be applied to medicine. But it needs to be real time and continual, with hubris left at the front door and a lot of trust. And I think some of the issues now are basically rooted in a lack of total trust. And I think we need to slowly be more trusting of, I think, AI deployment in healthcare. So lastly, a few words about one of my favorite symphonies. I'm a Mozart fan, but Beethoven's Ninth is something that you just have to be awed by. I was listening to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony when I was finishing my slides for this talk, and it was very inspiring. The range and the depth and the diversity of instruments. And we're coming up on, I think, the 200th anniversary of the time that Beethoven wrote the symphony. It's just grand in terms of scale and the instruments. And first time we've added, he's added, or any composer added human voice to an orchestra. Until the Ninth Symphony, which is often described as the ultimate musical composition, until the Ninth Symphony, there were no human voices involved in a musical composition with an orchestra. It seems hard to believe, but that's absolutely true. So when it was performed, it was just really shook the music world. And in terms of the innovation and the depth and the range and the grandeur of the music, first of all, it was the longest symphony ever, but it really made Beethoven sort of even more famous. As you know, this was his last complete work. So how do we tie this into AI medicine, you're wondering? Okay, so let's pretend the clinicians are the string players, all right? The violins, the violas, and the cellos. But where are we in AI medicine? Are we actually in the classical / romantic period, like when Beethoven wrote the Ninth Symphony? We're not. I think we're more in the Renaissance period, where instruments are starting to be assembled to play together. So we're not in the medieval period, so that's the good news. I think we're in the Baroque, the Renaissance period, where we're starting to come together more. The instruments are still relatively primitive in its diversity and range, but we're starting to play music together. I feel like we're in the Renaissance period. The nice thing about the Renaissance period is, as you know, that's where the Medici effect really took place. So all these different disciplines coming together really, really affected the eventual range and number of innovations in music. Now, so what should the string players do in the symphony? Let's go back to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and the string players are the clinicians. I think the clinicians, I think one of the questions I get asked often is from clinicians who are interested now in AI medicine. And the questions are, one, what programming language should I study? And two, how do I get started? So those are always the common questions. And my answer is usually pump on the brakes before you jump into programming. Maybe it's good to also think about yourself and your career and what you want to do with this, and not necessarily just jump into a programming language, because first of all, I always encourage clinicians not to leave medicine to go into this, because that clinician insight and wisdom is so badly needed right now in AI medicine. In some ways, probably even more needed than data science aspects. So I always encourage them to stay in medicine and maybe appreciate the possibilities and limitations of AI rather than jump into a programming language. Because to be really proficient at a programming language, as I found out the hard way, it's not hundreds of hours, it's actually probably thousands of hours to get really good and independent with coding. And you wonder if that time for some people is better spent just learning about AI, learning about the limitations, learn how to review a paper, learn how to assess a project. These are all things you can do without learning how to code line by line. And you always have people. And one of my friends said, well, yeah, just using the analogy of clinicians as string players, you're a good violinist or excellent violinist. Don't jump and learn the trumpet when the trumpet shows up at the orchestra, because you're needed as a violinist as much more than you need as a trumpet player. So I think that's probably correct, that before you jump, I think it's good to have the discipline of learning a programming language, because as I said, I kind of learn how to deconstruct a complex problem into parts and learn how to work on those and try to put them together. And that's essentially one of the constructs of coding and programming, is you kind of have that discipline to deconstruct problems and sets of problems. And I think clinicians probably don't do that enough. We go with system one thinking, and I think the discipline is good, but I don't think you necessarily need or should spend thousands of hours to become a great programmer, because there are a lot of great programmers around, and perhaps you can make a contribution as a clinician a little bit differently than what you might think. This is a graphic of what I think is an important era to come in AI, and particularly in medicine. And that's using neurosciences, and Demis Hassabis of DeepMind at Google has done some great work in understanding the nuances of neuroscience, and not necessarily duplicate what the brain does, but understanding the principles so that we can build better artificial intelligence around neurosciences. And I think We see that I mentioned earlier that voices were heard for the first time in an orchestra, with an orchestra in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Perhaps that's a reminder for us that voices are important. The human voices are important. So I think the clinician cognition and wisdom and insights and creativity are very badly needed right now in AI medicine. And if you add that in terms of human elements, you can also add ethics, right? Ethics is also becoming even more important now. So we need more humans in the game of AI medicine to make this music. So I think the most important aspect from my perspective in AI medicine is inclusion of anything human. And that ranges from natural language processing to clinical cognition, and most importantly, human-to-human collaboration. And I just want to give a shout out to Matt and Kurt, who've been from AIMI, and all the support staff who've been so generous with the aspect of human-to-human collaboration between center and center, which is, I think, what we need to overcome very formidable enemies like the virus. I think that humans are, in a way, in a position to have to band together now, which is good. I think good for us. It took a pandemic for humans to want to work even closer together, but I think that's true more than ever before. So I think I humbly offered this quote from Anthony Bourdain, who I had the pleasure of having lunch with a few months before he passed away, but that he was so humble and he knew so much. And I like that set of characteristics. And I think that's, he says that there's no final resting place of the mind. And I continue to learn from everyone and anyone that I can talk to. And there shouldn't be a moment of smug clarity. The wisdom, and I think he's correct in saying this, is realizing how small you are and unwise and how far you have to go. I think that's a wonderful way to look at AI in medicine as well. And for those of you who are interested in going to the next level or just learning more, I know AIMI and Stanford has this amazing video course that I've actually participated in. I think it's quite good. Another resource that's available is on the monthly review courses that the American Board of AI Medicine offers with mixed faculty. I think Matt is due to come on in a month. So we really mix up the faculty and we talk about slides rather than presenting slides. So I think you'll enjoy the experience. The faculty enjoy the experience because they talk to different people all the time. And we actually offer an assessment that you can take after the course. And the course is pretty much based on the book that I had the privilege of writing with over 100 contributing authors, including a lot of my Stanford professor friends. And I think the journal is good. I have to give a shout out to Jeannie Shen, who turned in one of the top papers of the journal this past year from Stanford. And I think it was a beautiful way to show and demonstrate how clinicians and data scientists can work well together on a project. And we also have the Medical Intelligence Society that meets monthly. And we have a big meeting coming up at the end of July. Please participate in that. I think we have a few guest speakers from Stanford. And also I chair the AI Med meetings. And we continue to have big clinician series. Image focus subspecialties are coming out at the end of June. And end of September is going to be primary care and global health. And then we have our annual meeting next January. And I'm hoping that we'll have an in-person opportunity to meet some of you at that annual summit in January. It's January 18th to the 20th at the Ritz-Carlton in Laguna Niguel. And I want to thank my benefactor, Michelle Lund, who is the granddaughter of Walt Disney, who saw and agreed with the vision of AI in medicine in a health system, and also my many friends and colleagues and mentors at Stanford, who I always thank to give me this knowledge, amazing knowledge that hopefully I can make a difference with. And I know it's really sobering to be in the middle of a pandemic, but Albert Camus says in the depth of winter, there's going to be an invincible summer. I'm hoping that we'll get there. And here's my contact information. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Anthony. And I'm sure everyone, if we were together, we'd be applauding. Feel free to put the applaud emoji. I think we've started to try to use now, or unmute yourself and applaud. But that was fantastic. Thank you for this inspiring discussion. And really just kind of digging deep into your journey at the intersection of healthcare and technology. There were so many points where I was shaking my head in agreement with your perspective and vision. And so, I see we have some great turnout here, and a few questions already popping up in the chat, which is great. Please keep those coming. We have some time here to do a little Q&A. But before we get to some of the panel or some of the audience questions, I wanted to just kick off a quick discussion around a key insight or concept that you raised, which I think is at the heart of the work that we all do. You described it as cognitive shifting. Which was sort of your approach to solving healthcare problems with technology, kind of looking at both areas. And there's a fantastic book, if for those of you who haven't read it, it's called Range. It's by David Epstein. And the subtitle is Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And he actually raises a term called cognitive entrenchment, which was sort of, everyone is digging deeper into their own trench and rarely standing up to look at the next trench over, even though the solution to their problem might reside there, right? And that's a potentially a flaw of a lot of the systems that we've set up in academics, where specialization is just keep going straight ahead. That's a track. You just kind of run down that track. And breadth is tricky, right? You have to be creative. You have to be willing to sort of step outside your comfort zone, and that's challenging. But I think that your talk really,
yeah. I was going to say it's intellectual lockdown.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it gives you opportunity to think about, but I think that just in general, this talk was just a perfect encapsulation of the understanding of range and how we can draw from different disciplines. I've heard it described as intellectual arbitrage, pulling ideas and best practices from other groups. And I liked your suggestion about coupling clinical relevance and data science as part of evaluation metrics. How do we enforce these systems? And so my question would be, what other kinds of steps, can we take in both healthcare as the systems we've set up in education, but also in biomedical data science and computer science communities to ensure that we can, foster the kinds of cognitive shifting, to use your term, that I think provide the most potential for the work we do.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I know that's embedded in your DNA too. And I think just encourage everyone to go into the other world and spend some time. And I have jokingly say, Matt, you've heard this before, just take a data scientist out to lunch if you're a clinician and vice versa. You learn so much in that 1 hour conversation than probably going to a society meeting. so I think just spend some time with other people, and started having data scientists round with me in the hospital and spend some time with, we actually have a clinic called the iClinic, or Intelligent Clinic, an innovative clinic. We actually have the data scientists embedded in that clinic every time we have that clinic. And they offer such a range of different sort of contributions that makes it really valuable. As you know, some of the clinical problems that we have are really rooted in the informatics part not being as efficient and productive as it can be, right? So relatively easy problems to solve. And we've been able to come up with some solutions just having data scientists come to the clinic with us. And I think encourage a clinician, spend some time with a data scientist, go to a course, look at your course, which is just a great introduction to data science and so user-friendly, right? So just, jump in. The water's kind of warm, so.
Yeah, and you're right. And I think that education is a key piece to that, and sort of finding ways that we can become conversational in each other's world, right? And I think that's something that you fostered and do quite well. It's something that we've tried to do here at the AIMI Center as well, and with our partners. But you're involved in so many multi-institutional, projects and initiatives around this. And what kind of trends are you seeing from your perspective? And what do you think will be, the critical killer app, or the thing that we need to do as a field to realize the potential for all the things that we're trying to do?
I don't think there'll be a killer app. I think it'll be kind of slow, but I think that innovation is not going to be exponential for much longer. Although natural language processing might prove me wrong the way it's going. I think it's going to be like kind of, sort of jig-jagging our way up the curve. There'll be some really amazing developments and they're going to slow down. So we need to really just like a good driver, right? You need to really be patient around the curves or the chicanes. We're going to have some chicanes coming up in AI medicine where the delivery and execution is not the level people hyped it to be. And we kind of artificially created these chicanes, and we need to be patient. We're going to win the race, but we're going to need to be patient and use the right speed and the right talent. And I think, one good way is to look at this as a 10 to 25 year journey rather than what is it going to deliver this year. I think you're going to be disappointed. And I think it's just going to follow Amar's law and the hype cycle like everything else. I think it's amazing the level of resource we have. It's just kind of wedging it into medicine is a challenge, and we're going to need all the clinicians to embrace this as much as we can, because I think it's going to take a lot of clinicians to make this work. I think the data scientists in a way have done their share already, and they're trying. But as you know, you and I talk about this all the time. It's just when you go out into the real world, it's very different. And when you do it real time, it's even more challenging. So I think we need every clinician we can get to help us.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And, I've sort of just, found that when you have clinicians that are kind of entering this community, starting to think about their problems in a new way, I think that's ultimately what's needed, because it's the real world evidence, it's real world experience, right? That really comes to bring to bear on a problem, right? That's easy to kind of articulate in a paper or a grant statement, but when you are sitting in the clinic with a patient sitting in front of you, that's when it becomes more real, right? And some of the decisions you're making are more important.
Think of all the real world problems that we could solve with good data scientists, even during this pandemic: scheduling, workflow, prioritizing. And yet I feel like half of the effort went into looking at x-rays in the COVID era. Not x-rays a bad thing, Matt, but God, it was just
no offense taken.
Yeah, it was just a total imbalance of what data scientists think we needed. We did not need a faster, better way of diagnosing COVID from a chest X-ray or even a CT. It was just as any paper, if not more, on CTs. Any clinician can diagnose COVID. I mean, we don't need that. What we needed was help with everything else that's going on in the world. Yeah.
Well, along those lines, we have a great question in the chat here from Joseph O'Donnell, who's asking, what kind of data quality improvements do you think would have benefited the pandemic work, or would benefit the pandemic efforts that we're doing?
Yeah, I think we just were caught totally off guard with how bad the data and IT infrastructure. I think it's two things. I think every hospital should just really, really do a deep dive on their data strategy. And I think data strategy was a document, which just wasn't followed. It was obvious, I think, when people were looking at data. As you recall, some of the early New England Journal papers were even full of data issues that actually led to people rescinding their articles.
Yeah.
So we're so vulnerable to data. And it's the one thing I always say is it's kind of political, but it's not. It's the data, stupid. It's all about data, access, bias in data, accuracy of data. And it's not, the AI part is pretty robust, but it relies, just like a car, relies on that fuel. The fuel is the data, and the data isn't good enough, then the car's not going to go so well. So we need to spend more time. And if someone doesn't want to code and is interested in coding, the one thing they can work on is the data. I think the data is really, really far behind, and we need to really work on data. But the AI is the North Star, right? So if we know what AI is capable of doing, hopefully that will elevate everyone's game in data and IT, and that's what I'm hoping.
Yeah, that I 100% agree. In fact, if you follow some of the computer science luminaries who are talking about this across industries, not just in healthcare, Andrew, I think, Yang is being one of the particular groups that his work is now saying we need to have much more focus on the data and the quality, right, and curation, and having just a deep understanding of the data before we start looking for the newest architecture or the newest machine learning approach to solving a problem. You talked a lot in a very inspiring way, obviously a tragic story of what inspired you to sort of look for solutions outside of our current ways of doing things when you talked about Elsie. And, you went back to school late in your career. You mentioned that this is one of the toughest programs in the country, and you took it on, later in your career, which is, my hat's off to you. That's amazing. What led you to pursue that degree, and how did you foresee kind of the revolution? Because you really did this before it was a thing, right? Before we all were talking about it. And that sort of addresses maybe Matt's question in the chat about, would a dual degree be an advantage, or do you see that as an advantage in your life for as a practicing physician, but also someone who wants to work in data science?
Yeah, I think it's a personal question. It depends on what you want to do with this knowledge. I think you can do plenty without going back to school, and school was tough, especially at Stanford. Russ Altman wasn't kidding when he said, "This is going to be tough for you." And he, in a very positive way, said, "You can just hire people to do what you want to do." And I said, "Well, I'm a violinist, and occasionally, if the conductor's late, I get to play conductor." I think it's a different feel for the music when you play the violin and you're conducting the string section. And I think you should also learn about the trumpets too, but I think it's a different feel. And I think that 5–10% extra edge that you have knowing both areas can maybe, perhaps enable you to come up with really innovative ideas, just like Jim Hall did with the rare wing concept. It just gives you that little edge that the two domains, even with very talented people, may not be able to come up with that 5% of the time coming up with an innovative project idea or contribution. So I think we need people that can speak both languages as much as we can. I was kidding with Ted Drella, who's listening. I think the number of clinicians with a modern data science knowledge is probably less than the number of astronauts right now. I don't run across too many. You're one of them, Matt. But not too many that can speak comfortably about all of the data science and AI stuff. We need thousands more, right? So right now, just too few. But the few of us are gathering and talking about things. And as you know, we're convening for different reasons. And I think it's going to be really, really big when we have enough momentum and mass to do things together. It's going to be very exciting, I think, in a few years.
No, it's been inspiring. I mean, again, I know we're at time here, but I really want to say thank you for your time, for your insights, your wisdom, for coming and speaking with us, and towards the efforts of just trying to disseminate the knowledge of what this field can potentially do for us in healthcare and for our patients. There's really no better person to sort of convey that big picture view. So thank you again for your time. Sorry we couldn't get all the questions, folks. Thanks for joining. We will be posting this video for anyone to view very shortly. And then also feel free to check out the AIMI website for future speakers and other educational opportunities for those of you kind of starting to dip your toes into the, as Anthony describes, the warm waters of AI and healthcare. So thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here with you today and to hear your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you, Matt, for all you do and all Kurt is doing for with AIMI. It's really a real beacon for all of us to really think about AI in healthcare. So thank you for doing that too. So.
Thank you. All right. Well, till next time. See you guys. Thank you.